The calendar is usually a good place to find it.
Yep.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is Tuesday, February 23rd. This is a joint committee meeting of Senate Finance and Senate Education. We are looking and considering today the weighting study, also known as S13. Senator Cummings and I have spoken to the pro tem, and what Senator Bound has asked us to do is, since there's jurisdiction on this for both committees, to have a conversation, hear a walkthrough, hear from some key witnesses, and then for each committee to have a conversation and get a sense of what it really thinks what it wants to do, as well as what it can do between now and crossover. So with that, Senator Cummings, is there anything else that you'd like to add, or is there anything that I'm missing?
No, I think we're all on the same page on that one.
Okay, great. So with that,
Senator Campion,
yes, please.
may I ask a big picture question? The weighting study, is it slated to be adopted if we don't act, or do we have to adopt it? Can you just give us the big frame? Like, how is it going to be
Senator
used
Bray,
or
I'm
not?
going to ask you to hold your questions because we are all in the same spot. We're all learning about it together, ensemble, if you will. So, but it would be something I can tell you that we would have to adopt. Things don't just go into statute unless we take action. So with that, I am going to turn it over, unless somebody wants to correct me, one of my senior colleagues. I think it would probably be best. Jim, are you planning to take us through this?
I was not listed as a witness, so I thought I wasn't aware I was doing a walkthrough.
I'm just wondering if it makes sense for you to give us a high overview of things, although you're not on the schedule, so that we all can be on the same page.
Sure. So I'm wondering which bill you're looking at. Are you looking at a specific bill?
We're looking specifically at S13, the weighting study.
S13. Okay. I'm not prepared, but I'm happy to go through it. Jean, can you pull that one up for me, please?
It'll take me a minute. I have to pull it up.
Okay.
I think, Jim, if you don't mind, I mean, I know you brought our committee through it once. Even if it's a high level overview, I think it would be helpful for all of us. And then we could jump right into our witnesses.
Sure, of course. Yep, happy to.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I apologize for not giving you the heads up on that.
No problem.
Faith, are you there? Can you help me out with this, please?
Jeannie, I'm here. What do you need?
Need to post S13.
Hey, Connie? Can you come here? Hey, Steve? Hey, Connie?
I'm just really glad Senator Campion didn't ask me to walk through the weighting study, because that would have been bad for everybody.
Mr. Chair, are we on break?
This is get to know you time.
Well, Senator Pearson can walk us through what happens when some bands of monkeys have all the bananas and others.
We're going to be sorry you ever read that, Senator.
Jeannie, I just posted it. Will you see if it came through?
Sorry, with this confusion, I feel like I'm a Senate natural. I'm in Senate Finance, right?
Whoa. Oh.
No, listen, I'm responding to a text. Sorokin, quiet.
That's harsh.
I can let folks know that S13 is basically the bill that we passed out of committee last year after looking at the weighting study.
Yeah, I guess I think what happened, and correct me if I'm wrong, Senator Perschlich, you guys passed it out. Senator Bruce thought it ended up in Senate Finance, and then we went on recess because of COVID. I'm not sure if it ended up in Finance or not, but it seems like it could belong there. Okay.
Given the last 5 minutes, how do you spell waiting?
Jim, are you ready to roll?
Yes, I'm ready to roll.
Great.
I will say my daughter is about to leave for England in the next 10 minutes. So I have to jump out and say goodbye to her at some point.
Oh,
But
Jim, of course.
let me just go through what I can, okay? So let's see. This is
Jim. Give us literally the 2-minute overview, and then we'll go right to Secretary French.
okay. Okay, so this is proposing to implement the develop a plan to implement the changes. So this is very much like what we did last year in Senate Education. You have some findings which I won't go through, but going through, they talk about 173 and about what the report's about, and then the heart of this is section 2. So by December 15th of this year, the agency will work with the State Board of Education and various stakeholders, the Bs, to develop a plan for the implementation of the report's recommended weighting changes. It's specifically referring to Table E1 of the report's executive summary, which has a certain set of weights. So I don't have that in front of me right now to show you which ones they are, but it's very specific as to which ones this plan would be targeting. And then what the plan would do is create a timeline for phasing in a design that is sensitive to the effects on property taxes, consideration of the formula's interaction with various other provisions of law, including the excess spending threshold and responsible grants, etc. And then, let's see. Okay, and then the State Board, which is what it did during Act 46, the State Board would again go around the state, either virtually or in person, and educate the public about what these changes mean and take their input, and would communicate to the agency to help inform the plan. And then that plan would be delivered to you by December of this year. And then lastly, just to kind of note that there's more work to be done. So this is kind of language that is not necessary, I guess, but just saying that to move forward on this, you have to have implementation next year, obviously with a vote on both House and Senate and by the governor. And that's it. It takes effect on passage.
Jim, thanks a million. And please give your daughter our best.
Okay.
Secretary French.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Want me to go ahead and jump in?
Yeah, if you would be so kind as to just fill in any holes, anything that you think we should know, in both committees as we move forward with this or not move forward. Also be important to hear whether or not the agency and the administration have a position as to whether or not we should move forward, and some of the sort of compelling reasons to move in one direction or another.
Okay, good afternoon. For the record, I'm Dan French, Secretary of Education. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the waiting study. I thought I do have some written testimony I'm going to put on the screen in a minute, but just by way of sort of table setting, I think it's important to sort of acknowledge where the waiting study comes from a intellectual process. It really comes from special ed reform, and particularly Act 173. So if you're familiar with Act 173 and that special ed policy, which is a multi-year policy, the essential aspect of that from a financial perspective is shifting our current reimbursement model for special education expenses to a block grant. And by definition, that means a finite pot of money being allocated to school districts for special education costs. So the question emerged in order to make that transition, should there be some acknowledgement that some districts have more special needs students than others, or students with disabilities more than others? So should there be some sort of weight, if you will, introduced into that new special ed block grant? And that's sort of the genesis of the waiting study from my perspective to answer that question.
Frozen for me.
Comes to the conclusion or the surfaces the idea that should we do something with weights in the new special ed block grant under 173, or should we do something under the general education spending weighting? You know, and that's sort of an important policy decision. I think that the General Assembly ultimately has the answer, but that's sort of the context for the waiting study. And I will also say, as way of introduction, and these are just sort of my editorial comments, having worked with the authors at some length, because the agency was essentially the contract holder on the study, that the waiting study does not provide specific policy recommendations on what to do with its results. So that's really the business of the General Assembly. And that's to answer your question, Senator, about what are we doing? You know, you're really trying to assess what the import of the waiting study is and then what to do next. The waiting study does include some modeling to illustrate the impact of its findings, and also actually includes some tools if policymakers were inclined to I won't say play with those indicators just to understand how they interrelate with each other. But those should not be construed as a plan for implementation. You know, those are essentially just models. So, you know, that from my perspective, that is the work before the General Assembly, is to understand the import of the waiting study and then decide on how to implement it or not. And since you prompted, and essentially why I'm here is to say, well, what does the administration think of the waiting study? I'll transition to sort of my written testimony. I'm going to try to put it on the screen here. I think she gave me permission. Yep, she did. If you can see that, can you see that okay?
Not yet.
It's not up yet.
Okay. Things are a little locked up on my end. I think I'm gonna. Still not there?
Not yet.
Okay, it's sort of locked up on my end, but I'll try to talk through it, and I'll also try to cancel it.
Is it something, Secretary French, you've already submitted that would be on our website? Or?
Yeah, I did this morning. I'm wondering if I might have to come back out of the call because now my desktop is locked up. But I'll try to walk through it a little bit.
I mean, you're welcome to go back out. I mean, this meeting's going so well as it is since I've. I mean, feel free to. Since this is probably my last day as chair, I'm willing to go ahead and try other things if you'd like.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm just wondering what's kind of, oh, there we go. Maybe something's happening on my end, maybe not. Just if you could be patient 1 second, maybe I'll have a resolution here of this. Yeah, it's exciting. Hey, my desktop's free again. That's good. I think I'll stop. I won't share. I'll just have a conversation. If that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Just one moment. I have my desktop. There we go. So my written testimony is really focused a little bit on, what is our position on the weighting study, but also specifically to respond to the two bills that I'm aware of that are in play. One of them, as you mentioned, Senate Bill 13, and the other's H54. But to start off, firstly, yeah, we think the weighting study is very important. It's essentially, in terms of our commitment to equity as a state, one of its conclusions, firstly, is that the weights that we currently have, and just sort of put this in context again, we have this concept of equalized pupils, which is not an uncommon concept around the country. Different types of students cost more to educate. And so we do some weighting behind that. So we count up the number of kids, then we give them a weight based, for example, students in poverty get more weight. Students who are English language learners get more weight. The weighting study firstly analyzed our existing weights and basically discovered that there was no real mathematical basis for how the weights were established. The General Assembly, perhaps under the pressure of Act 60 or in that context of the Brigham decision, created them. But the researchers couldn't find any real empirical methodology behind the weights. So, that's an important acknowledgement. But secondly, they went on to derive some new weights based on empirical analysis. And my screen is now showing a document on the screen. Is that true? Or maybe Jean, you put it on.
There it is.
Great. So I think, when we consider that one of the essential purposes of Act 60 was really to equalize funding effort in the form of tax effort, meaning if a district in this community wanted to spend X dollars per student and another community that had a higher degree of property wealth wanted to spend the same amount, their tax rates would be the same. Essential element of achieving that is the pupil weights. And basically this study is concluding they're not working as designed. So that's a significant finding. And then the study goes on to present some alternatives to address these issues. So, your question, what is our position on this? We think the weighting study is a critical piece of research. It's an important study and should be given your immediate attention. I think, the point, particularly reacting to House Bill 54, which contemplates a sort of a phased-in approach, which I think is no doubt going to be part of the solution. But I would just make the observation that the analysis and the thoughtfulness that went into the weighting study, an equal amount of thoughtfulness and analysis should go into the implementation. So I to a certain extent, I appreciate House Bill 54 as being a conversation starter in that regard, but I think it's going to need some more work. And particularly Senate Bill 13 then goes on to say, yeah, we should create an implementation plan, but the agency should do it. And my response is the agency can't do it. Firstly, we don't have the capacity or we don't have the expertise, both to a certain extent, particularly with COVID right now. But I think certainly, continuing on with the efforts the General Assembly made in commissioning this report, that the General Assembly should commission or establish a implementation committee or entity to do that work. I've testified on this topic a couple times this session, and last year we started with the rollout of the weighting study. It's technical, it's involved, there's a lot to it. A lot of it is political. It's really, from my perspective, proving to be inadequate to approach this very complex topic sort of on one-off testimonies. And I appreciate two committees coming together today to hear me on this. But it is going to take some thoughtful implementation with some legislators, no doubt, that obtain greater fluency on this than their peers. So it's going to take some work. And I think it's worthy of that work. I just throw in a couple points from my perspective. And those are essentially, I'll wrap up my testimony with just sort of highlighting those. just to reiterate this idea that what's being proposed in the weighting study in terms of weights are a coherent and complete model. So initially, I saw folks interested in maybe taking some of the weights or tinkering with some of the others, and I don't use tinkering in a disparaging way. But it's important to acknowledge that the model was empirically derived. It is sound from a mathematical perspective. So just be very careful about doing that. And I think as a state, especially with our commitment to equity, that whatever we do in this area should be grounded in some defensible or defendable mathematical rationale. I would say that the issue, this kind of gets to number 3 on my list about, as I mentioned previously, I think you have a policy decision about should there be weights incorporated in the special ed block grant and or in the general funding formula. After listening to that conversation, in particular, we have an advisory group that the legislature formed as a result of 173 that has a lot of expertise from the special ed director community and so forth. My conclusion on that is that we should not endeavor to include an additional weight in the block grant, but we should ensure that the weights in the general education funding formula, and particularly the poverty weight, is established in accordance with the model, because I think that to a certain extent will address the issues. But I think the other concern, particularly from some of the qualitative data from the study, is that we just don't know yet how the block grant will affect how it will be implemented and how it will affect decision making on the part of districts relative to how they staff and pay for special education. So at this point, I think the approach should be first to establish weights in the general education funding formula in accordance to the weighting study, and then to monitor the implementation of Act 173, the block grant, to see if still issues emerge. That kind of approach makes a lot of sense to me. I think, with number 4 on my list, this is another theme that emerges often in testimony, is that giving districts more equalized pupils, or, there's going to be essentially winners and losers in terms of how that gets reshuffled in accordance with the weighting study. That does not equate to more money necessarily. It basically gives districts more equalized pupils, which creates the incentive perhaps, or at least the capacity to spend more with not seeing taxes go up in the same proportion. But it doesn't necessarily guarantee that districts will make those investments. So I made the observation early on last year in the House Ways and Means Committee about part of the solution there needs to be a review of the regulatory construct with the agency and the state board, and how we monitor education quality as a state. We've made a transition over the years away from what we call school quality standards to education quality standards, and the education quality standards are focused more on outputs, which I think is a very really good innovation to a certain extent. But in that process of moving away from what were school quality standards and essentially a regulation focused on inputs to exclusively more or less focusing on outputs, we've lost that sort of regulatory oversight that's so common in other states around the basic inputs that need to be in place. And what I mean by that is that the Agency of Education has a responsibility to ensure that there is baseline quality of our public schools. And by focusing on output, we've shifted some of our role away from that scrutiny. And I think it's precisely that, I'll say, healthy pressure from the state to bring schools up to a basic benchmark, if you will, in terms of quality, is what's necessary, particularly in these districts where there's higher degrees of poverty. This is what's necessary to compel them to make the investments that the weighting study would give them the capacity to make. Lastly,
Secretary, may I just interrupt there for one moment?
Yep.
When you say compelled, I just want to make sure that we're all following this accurately. Would districts actually be compelled to then, make the necessary financial decisions to support what we're talking about, or are we just sort of creating a system where people can make decisions as to whether or not they want to make that investment, or perhaps not?
Yeah, I think, I can answer that. I'm giving you 2 examples. One would be the question of school facilities and school construction, which is, emerged as an issue. Often when we hear the stories of some of the condition of our facilities, what I think is missing from that is that there was a time, and through what was called the public school approval process, where the state, through the agency, would go out and tell a school district, these conditions are unacceptable, you must fix them in order to continue to operate as a public school. And since the agency is not doing that function anymore, we've experienced a lot of deferred maintenance our buildings. As there's a lot of pressure on school budgets, and salaries are 80% of our costs, and school districts, unfortunately, are then up in the difficult position of having to cut things they can cut. And unfortunately, in my experience, that often results in maintenance issues being cut. The second example I'd mention, we already kind of do that to a certain extent. We have the federal law, Every Student Succeed Act, requires the agency to identify schools and districts in need of more support based on student outcomes. And that leads us to the ability to compel or to direct them to spend their federal monies to address the needs of those students that aren't doing as well. So that's, once again, it's sort of part and parcel typically of what any state agency does in education across the country. I'm not saying we've lost that altogether, but certainly we've definitely shifted our focus over the years, and it more or less, in my experience, correlates directly with the advent of No Child Left Behind Act, where we more or less got brought along that process of accountability, which just recently ended in 2014. And prior to that time, prior to 2000, we were doing these sort of basic quality assurance functions at the state level, and it made a real difference not only in the quality of the facilities, but also in assisting school districts. Providing the necessary pressure for those districts that aren't necessarily going to have broad public support for updating classrooms, building 21st century learning environments, making investments for the future, and so forth. So the state has a significant role in that, from my perspective. Lastly, I would just encourage you, particularly since there's significant interest in a weighting study, about doing something now. And I appreciate that. I think it is a compelling study, and that is essentially part of the question before you. But I can't help but also observe that there needs to be some appreciation of the context that we're in right now. And implementing the weighting study it's going to be a complex implementation task. And we have to be very careful, particularly right now in COVID, about destabilizing the education funding system. That we were able to partner with the General Assembly in August to freeze the average daily membership. You might remember that, that whole approach was around this issue of bringing stability to the funding system in the middle of an unprecedented global pandemic. And so we still have many of those forces of instability in front of us, including certainly COVID, and we're not sure yet what that work in front of us will look like as we're talking about COVID recovery. Basically, how the students were impacted by the emergency, and we know that'll be a multi-year effort. So we have instability in costs. We have instability, not necessarily in a bad way, but we have new federal revenues coming down all the time. We're not sure yet how that'll affect things. There are also a number, and I only put a few, but there are a number of new initiatives being contemplated by the General Assembly. In spite of its interest in focusing almost exclusively on COVID, there's still a number of major policy issues being contemplated by the General Assembly that will have a direct effect not only on the education fund, but also on education spending. And I listed some of them there. So, that is the context in which we're operating right now, to rapidly introduce a recalibration of the weighting system simultaneously in the middle of a pandemic, with all these other variables of cost and revenue being up for redefinition, and very dynamically so, I think would be irresponsible. So unfortunately, as much as I share the urgency on this topic, I think it deserves some analysis in terms from an implementation perspective. And that would also give us a little breathing room to get through the rest of, hopefully the rest of this emergency. So I'll conclude my comments there, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
That's very helpful, particularly your last comments with regard to what the agency is dealing with and timing. Questions or comments? Senator Chittenden.
So thank you, Senator, it's not Senator. Thank you, Secretary French. I really appreciate your written testimony. And item number 4 is where I wanted to expand upon, because I think it's one of my biggest things that I'm most concerned with. And I would just want to ask if you would agree with the following interpretation, that it's not only just a risk that the money won't be spent to address the needs, it could just lower tax rates. But on the other side of this, I'm concerned that with the winners and losers, the losing districts, this is going to push their tax rates up to the point where they won't pass their tax bills or their school budgets. I live in South Burlington. Over the last 3 years, we have had 5 or 6 failed school budgets. And so if we do that, my understanding of this weighting study, it's not drawing in more revenue. If anything, it will could lower the tax rates for the winning communities, and then the losing communities might just not approve their school budgets, which effectively would reduce the overall pie of dollars to then be spent on education. Is that an incorrect interpretation from this weighting study, or is that a fair assessment?
No, I think that's very fair, and I think it speaks to the political complexity of implementation. It's the political complexity is much greater than just winners and losers. It's really understanding the dynamics and also then matching that with what our policy objectives will be. And I would argue those policy objectives now are really being formed by a post-COVID environment. Also by the demographic challenges that existed prior to the COVID environment. But that is the context that will require, I think, some real focus on the part of policymakers to create a thoughtful implementation plan. Definitely need to do an implementation plan, don't get me wrong, but it's going to require a little bit more than just phasing it in and saying you're done with it.
Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Secretary French. It's great to hear the consistency in your testimony on this this topic. Basically, what you said today was what you said to us last year, with the addition of the COVID implications, obviously. This bill, when it was in Senate Education last year, I did not vote for it, actually. I voted against it in large part because of the, what I heard from the secretary then and what I'm hearing from him now is that there needs to be a broader implementation committee than just leaving it up to the Agency of Education. They don't have the capacity to do this work, and especially now during COVID. I actually had been working on my own bill related to this and had a broader implementation committee in mind. I didn't introduce it when I wasn't reassigned to the Education Committee. But I think that if we are going to move forward with S13, it's a good place to start. But I do think broadening it out and also including legislators in that implementation committee, because we need to build legislative capacity in our own bodies to be able to handle a major shift in our education finance system like this. I do think it's urgent that we move forward. There are districts that don't have the capacity to raise sufficient funds to meet the education standards and provide an equitable education for students. And I think we'll probably hear some testimony, and the Education Committee maybe already has. We heard a lot of it last year. But I also think there's a good chance that we could do it wrong if we don't take the time to consider all of the factors, such as the one Senator Chittenden just mentioned, but there are many, many, many others. So I just hope that we broaden out this implementation committee if we move it forward. And I had a question, and now I can't remember what it was. Oh, yes. So Secretary French, one thing I'd heard in testimony in another committee is that there's a possibility with all the additional federal funding that we're receiving right now to address some of these inequities through a sort of modified distribution using some of the elements of the weighting study for distributing that federal funding. Is that true? Did I misinterpret that, or can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. I'll just piggyback on your comments. I think the issue of agency capacity on this. Our function is largely a technical one, and certainly we have limited technical capacity relative to our responsibilities under COVID. But we stand ready to provide technical support for these deliberations. But I see the implementation largely being a political activity, and that's not something the administration, and particularly an agency, is well equipped to do thoughtfully. So we really need to have that. And I think to your point about building broader capacity inside the General Assembly to engage in this topic is going to be necessary. I think, the issue of federal dollars is, in looking at a general level, I think also to me gives me a sense that this is the time to do the implementation. It perhaps will provide a little bit of cushion to navigate some of this, because if you remember what the condition of the education fund was in April, when we were admiring, I think at one point, $168 million deficit. And as federal dollars kicked in, we were able to basically get rid of that whole situation. The federal dollars could function, provide some cushion here to find a path forward to address the issues that Senator Chittenden sort of highlighted. But I think it will be a challenging conversation. Don't get me wrong. But I've had a number of conversations. As I mentioned, there's a lot of interest in the General Assembly in establishing a COVID relief platform or program. And part of that conversation, particularly I've had some conversations with JFO around, what are some of the federal sources that are targeted directly to school districts, mainly what we call the ESSER fund, the Elementary Secondary Education Relief. And that appears to be a consistent vehicle for the delivery of federal dollars. So we saw ESSER was kind of a small program last spring. It was $30 million compared to the larger pot of money in the CRF, which was $1.2 billion. But then we recently saw ESSER 2 being $127 million for Vermont. So basically 4 times as much. And what's being contemplated for ESSER 3 in this new package coming out of Congress is probably going to be double that. And the ESSER funds come with some pretty strong restrictions that were put in place back in April when no one knew what was in front of us in terms of COVID response. And those restrictions basically are, I'll say, restrictions from a state perspective. There's a lot of flexibility at the local level, but 90% of those funds must be delivered directly to school districts. So there's a conversation emerging nationally and certainly in Vermont about, can we make sure those funds are directed more strategically? Is this an opportunity for us to address some things? And when I did have a meeting with JFO, I think they had mentioned this issue of addressing some of the themes of the weighting study, particularly on poverty. And they were basically just, I think, trying to get oriented to what ESSER program looked like. Similarly, we've been contemplating those sort of strategic use of the funds. Our sort of more focused area is on deferred maintenance, some of the issues that I mentioned previously on the regulation side. At any rate, I think it's not clear how we're going to proceed in that regard, but I think it is fair to say that we could contemplate the use of federal dollars here in a way that would help the smooth transition of the weighting study, and that's a useful lens to apply in this situation.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. That's what I was hoping you would say. Don't waste an emergency. We can use that to help with our longer term goals.
Other questions for Secretary French? Senator Pertzler.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary French, have you guys thought at all about categorical grants? Because one of the things that I heard recently about the weighting centers, it still doesn't get to kind of what the cost is of educating these children appropriately. It does do the weighting better, but it doesn't get to the costs. And given some of these complexities we talk about, some people have suggested the Act 173 method of providing categorical grants and say, okay, this is how much it's going to cost. So here's the money for that specific issue. Let's say like learning English as a second language. Has that entered your discussions at all in the agency, or is it all a bit about the weighting?
Well, I think it's firstly, I'd observe that, the folks behind the weighting study, notably Dr. Colby, who I think you're all familiar with, and Dr. Baker. I mean, the research behind the weighting study is situated pretty solidly in the national body of research. And they're the experts. I would encourage you to bring them in to talk about this kind of, the function of a categorical weight approach. But I believe they do surface in the weighting study just the sort of raising the flag that perhaps the state should look at the issue of a categorical grant, particularly as it comes down to mental health and some of the social service delivery. There was a question raised in the last several legislative sessions about to what extent are schools, financing social services through the education fund. And I think the weighting study mentions it. It doesn't, from my end, sort of provoke a specific solution, but it does raise that for a point of conversation. I've recently brought that issue up relative to school construction aid. So just to recap, I mean, most states, I would say all states except for Vermont, basically have a foundation aid formula for education. As the name implies, the state gives a base amount of funding. And then on top of that are layered a series of categorical grants that are designed and focused. I mean, the whole purpose, I think, of a categorical grant is the General Assembly gives direction for money to be spent in a specific way. But it's on top of that foundation. It's important to acknowledge that, things like construction aid, although they function like categorical grants in any situation, but Vermont doesn't have foundation aid anymore. That's essentially the big transition we made with Act 60. We have this big pot of money called the Education Fund, which by design is supposed to incorporate all education spending. So even when we look at things like a block grant in special education, the origin of those funds are the education fund. It's not like, we're putting extra dollars on the table necessarily. So I think it is important to look at the issue of categorical aid relative to the general funding formula. The weighting study is a great starting point. And I think that would be, again, an important consideration for an implementation committee would be to evaluate the use of categorical grants. It might be too much to take on in that initial implementation conversation, but I think it would be useful conversation for follow-up. So back to the idea of school construction aid, that was a categorical grant, again, provided on top of foundation aid. The foundation aid formula went away more or less, simultaneously, if you will, at the same time we did a moratorium on the categorical grant in 2007. A few years earlier, we made the transition to Act 68. So, to what extent would the state provide a categorical grant on top of this very unique funding system to focus on the issue of school construction? I think those are really great conversations. So we have some other work to do relative to the very unique nature of our funding system.
Great. Senator Chittenden.
So to follow up on that, my understanding, limited as it is, on how schools are funded in this state, I would interpret categorical aid to have the same effect on the property tax rates. What I understand is when that categorical aid is accounted by the school, it's the difference, the remaining amount that affects their property tax rate. So it has the same effect that the weighting study would in lowering tax rates when we give categorical aid. Is that a true statement?
Almost. It depends on how you look at it at the local level versus the state level. So yes, at the state level, it all is going to contribute to the aggregate education spending. But the difference under our funding formula is that each district has a different categorical. I'll use transportation reimbursement as a really good example, I think. All the other sources of revenue that a school district has in Vermont are called local revenues, even if they originate from things like transportation aid. So if you look at a school district budget, you have the expenditure budget, and then you have a revenue section. All aspects of that revenue section, except what comes from the ed fund, are called local revenues. Even if they come from federal sources like meals, student meal reimbursement, transportation reimbursement, special ed reimbursement, they're all aggregated together to call local revenues. What's left over, which arguably is the biggest pot of money in the revenue section, is what comes from the ed fund, which is called education spending. So you subtract your reimbursements to the categorical grants, if you will, before you calculate education spending. So I use transportation as a really kind of unique example, even though, again, it all comes out of the back end, and that's what factors into your thinking around yield values, because you got to pay the bill at the end of the day. But how it plays out locally can vary significantly. And transportation is a great example of that, because under Vermont law, school districts are not required to provide transportation. They may choose to do so if they want to, but they don't have to. And we provide some reimbursement for them when they do. So not all districts have transportation reimbursement revenue in their budgets, and some have a lot more than others. But it's just an example, again, of how I think we need to understand the difference between the Vermont funding system fundamentally being different than pretty much any other state that has a sort of tradition of a foundation formula and layers of categorical grants. We throw it all into one pot, but how it sort of manifests itself at the local level in terms of categorical grants can vary significantly depending on the program.
Okay. Any other questions for Secretary French before we hear from other witnesses? Senator McDonald.
So are we going to, we basically have a choice of taking some time to figure this out, or taking too much time and having the courts tell us to get off our backsides and do something? Is that where we're at now?
Is that directed at Secretary French?
Yes.
Yeah, I was hoping that was a rhetorical question. I think it is. It's a fair point. I think the waiting study. I was working with the contractors all along, and I can't help but admire it. I think it's anchored and situated in a national body of research, as I mentioned, that's very compelling. So I can't help but conclude that you're going to have to take action on this one way or the other. Secondly, I would say you should endeavor to take action on it, because we have a commitment to equity in the state that is also, I wouldn't say unique, but it's very emphatic. And Act 60, sort of underscores that. So I think we are compelled to action. And I would say, yes, if the General Assembly can't find a path forward to do that, that one should anticipate, the courts at some point doing that. And just sort of my layman's perspective on that, when the courts get involved, I think Senator Hardy mentioned, doing a thoughtful response on this. The courts come up probably with the least thoughtful response. So I think there's an opportunity for you to focus on implementation. Perhaps the COVID revenues coming to the state provide also some additional energy behind that. I would hate to see us have to engage in a less than thoughtful approach to implementation because the courts ordered you under a fixed timeline to do it.
Fair enough. Senator McDonald, do you have a follow-up?
Oh, the traditional logjam here is that the towns that have the resources in the current system, which measures property tax resources pretty well, and has brought a high degree of equity in spending from top to bottom, but the individual wealth isn't taken into account. The income wealth of towns, they're not going to want to give up the funds that they have to spend on their school districts, which are desirable and people want to go to, and get high test scores to send money to the districts that have that are heavily weighted. I mean, if they come in and pony up and say, yeah, we have to do this, then you can solve it in no time. But I imagine they'll be dragged kicking and screaming to do that. So is the Agency of Education volunteering to come up with a thoughtful plan and then ask the legislature to oppose it?
No, as I said, we'd be perfectly equipped to provide some technical back end for that work, but the questions you just raised are largely political questions. I would just say the General Assembly commissioned this report. It's your report. You've created the questions the researchers were to answer. They've answered the questions very thoroughly. And I would just say all of us have a responsibility then to act upon those findings. And we certainly would partner in doing that. But I think I would say the shortcoming of S13, there's no partnership in S13. It's exclusively given to the agency to do. Our capability is really technical. Certainly we can help with the modeling, as we did with the weighting study. We provided some of that data and so forth. But it's going to require policymakers to take a more direct role into the perspective of you all, or to the greatest extent possible. There needs to be greater fluency in the General Assembly on these issues, because there are going to be related policy questions that come up even after implementation, such as issues of transportation or construction aid and so forth. And right now, we've lost some of that connection to the Act 60, Act 68 fluency that was in the General Assembly previously.
The history of changing formulas for aid to education, and one of the precepts is nothing changes if the losers aren't held harmless, and that takes money.
Yeah, I would just say it might not be as dramatic as you point to. Our system has been fairly stable I would agree with you that one of the characterizations of foundation aid formulas is that the legislatures in those states often every other couple of years, they tinker with them and they never seem to put enough money into the foundational piece. But I think I don't necessarily agree that the weights are going to end up with money moving one way or the other. I think it does get back to the core aspect of Act 60, however, and this is where some of the urgency for folks that are advocating for a more immediate implementation emerges. Is it fair? You know, is it fair? You know, is what was inherently part of Act 60 to address the issues of equal effort? Basically, the weighting studies concluding the weights are not functioning as intended in that regard, and there are communities all around the state that would desire to and need to spend more of their students relative to who those students are, and an acknowledgement that those students cost more to educate than others. And so we, you know, if we are going to be sincere to our commitment to equity, we have a fundamental condition of equity is to ensure the funding equity.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We're going to move on since I know your chair has witnesses at 3, as do we. So if we may, Ms. Capitani. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And please, if you're interested, please stick around. Thanks for being with us. Welcome to Senate Ed and Senate Finance. It's good to see you, Vicki.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Senator Campion.
And so you've followed this discussion, and I believe you've followed it now for a while. So we would appreciate your thoughts, your perspective. You're the chair of the Dover Select Board, and I know you've also been involved with education policy for a long time. So if you wouldn't mind starting just by introducing yourself, tell us a little bit why it's important for you to be here, and any thoughts you have as we move forward.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to testify. I actually have a prepared statement, which I submitted, so I'd like to read that since I don't do that often. And I'm here on behalf of Equitable Education Advocates. I am the chair of the Dover Select Board. And I'm here to urge you to take immediate action to fix the broken education finance system, because it is unfair to rural and economically disadvantaged students. First, I'll give you a little background about me. I'm a native Vermonter, and I was educated in our local school system. I am the co-owner of the Deerfield Valley News with my husband, Randy. I served on the school board for 9 years, and I'm currently in my 10th year on the Dover Select Board. I have been involved in education governance for decades at both the state and local level. This is my 3rd time testifying in front of the State House, and I'm a passionate advocate for equitable, quality education for our children. The statewide education reforms over the past 20+ years significantly impacted our region. We have been very engaged in order to offer the best education possible to our local kids. Our students are left withering on the vine. The promise of Brigham has not happened. In fact, as the legislature's weighting study conducted by UVM has shown, the inequities have just been shifted. Rural and poor students have suffered. For us, this is not about the pain of an increased tax bill. We are not here to seek reduced taxes. We are here to advocate for quality education for our students. Our region has done everything you've asked of us. We started Act 46 mergers before the mandate and followed through. We joined the statewide insurance program. We constantly seek out special grants, and our focus has always been on quality. The results have not been what we'd hoped for. In fact, we are going backwards now. The way the funding has been allocated has not been equitable. Penalties punish our communities for trying to provide for our students, only compounding the problem. Programs are cut, maintenance is deferred, and our children suffer. Here are some examples of negative impacts. Almost no AP classes for our high school students. Excuse me. inadequate student transportation services, unequal access to language classes, deferred maintenance and inferior school facilities, and test scores are falling behind. What is causing this? Looking at the numbers revealed in the legislature's weighting study, we see, and these numbers come directly from the weighting study simulator posted on the AOE website. The legislature has failed to recognize the difference in cost per pupil for educating students in poverty, in geographically necessary rural and small schools, and for English language learners for more than 2 decades. I'm going to give you some examples. Please keep in mind that you are listening to these examples with that an underweighted district has a higher per pupil spending calculation than they should, and an overweighted district has a lower per pupil spending calculation than they should. When you look at the data, the 2018 data provided as part of the study, we see that almost all the rural isolated mountain school districts surrounding the town of Dover are being underweighted, meaning these districts have either, one, not had access to equitable resources to educate their children. Two, their taxpayers have been paying more to provide equitable resources in violation of Brigham. Or three, likely a little of both. Using the corrected weights, the equalized pupil count in 2018 would be, for example, in Wardsboro, a district we merged with in 2019, was underweighted by 10% of their equalized students, meaning instead of 116 students, Wardsboro should have been calculated at 129 students. The difference is 13 students. Reedsboro was underweighted by 28%. They were counted at having 75 students, 30 less than they would under properly weighted, which would have been 105. Jamaica was underweighted by 22%, 59 students instead of 75, 16 students too low. These are some of the neighboring elementary schools. When the students from these students go to high school, you can see the problem is then being compounded. For instance, in Brattleboro, the equalized pupil counts are underweighted by 15%, 1,101 students instead of 1,298, a difference of 197 students. In Bennington at Mount Anthony, we can see the equalized student counts are underweighted by 14%. In Chittenden County, we can see from the analysis that the districts like Essex and Mount Mansfield are 20 and 25% overweighted for their equalized pupil counts. In Burlington and Winooski are 15 and almost 40% underweighted. By failing to correct this 20-year-old educational injustice, we are incentivizing more spending on students who cost less to educate, the overweighted districts. At the same time, underweighted districts are incentivized to spend less on students who cost more to educate. Our students are not only the heart of our communities, our schools, are not only part of the heart of our communities, but they're also the catalyst for our local economy because they bring young people and life to our region. We are asking for you to act now to correct these longstanding inequities. Our schools and communities do not have time to spare. We are on the brink of collapse, and we are looking for you to turn the ship around and stop this financial race to the bottom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Senator Pearson.
Thank you. I don't know if this is a fair question to ask you, but I'm going to try because sounds like been thinking about this for a long time. And I'm struck that the region you live in would have a real mix of communities in terms of this question. And, there's no community really that's saying maybe our kids are getting too good a deal. You know, we're over-resourced in our high school. And you mentioned several communities right here in my district in Chittenden County, and it's real pluses and minuses. So what somebody asked us before, but and again, maybe this is not a fair question, but what would you suggest we do to the towns that are over counted right now, and if we put in a more fair formula, would stand to lose ground? That is going to cause a lot of upheaval, just as the injustice is causing upheaval. Any suggestions for us? Because as legislators, that is going to be the sticking point, I suspect.
Well, thank you for asking that question. And I understand where you're coming from. When Act 60 came in, it cost a lot of towns a lot of money.
Yeah.
And there was a major shift. It was a gigantic shift. I think we all hoped that it would be an answer, and it really hasn't been an answer for particularly the poor and rural schools that are small around here, but are very geographically isolated. And they're just literally hanging on by the skin of their teeth. It's very difficult. If you have a boiler go out, your budget will be busted, and you are then going to be paying into the penalty box to get it fixed. And that is just not equitable. That's not your fault. That's not your community's fault. It's not the teacher's fault. It's just a reality of life. And so I think that this hurts. Yes, you can put it in phases, but yeah, it's hurting us now.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Appreciate the very local and the experienced testimony. Please keep in touch. I know you will as we make our way through this. I think you heard during the introductory comments that both committees are going to have committee conversations, committee discussions around this, talk to the pro tem to see what the path forward is. So thank you, Vicki, and it's great to see you.
Thank you for letting me speak.
Committee, Mr. Yin, good afternoon. I see you have joined us.
Good afternoon, Chair Campion and Chair Cummings.
Thanks for being with us. As I understand it, you are a school board member in the Winooski district. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is.
Great. And so I think you came in a little bit after we had some preliminary and even some in-depth conversations, but I think you understand the bill that we're contemplating and generally the idea that we're contemplating. And we've heard a little bit about your school district. I know we have in Senate Ed, and you came up again today in Senate Finance. So thank you for being here, and thank you for taking some time to give us your thoughts on this. So with that, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Chair Campion and Chair Cummings. And really, I want to thank the members of the Senate Education and the Senate Finance Committee for really giving me this opportunity to offer this testimony on behalf of the Student Waiting Coalition, which consists of school districts and supervisory units from all over the state. It's a coalition that, it unites both urban and rural areas together on an issue that I think we believe ensures a healthy and viable future for Vermont. And I'm here speaking to you about the implementation of the recommendations made in the Pupil Waiting Factors report, made in this report for this legislative session. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you examples of my personal experience serving on the Winooski School Board. And I'm here, but I'm also wanting you to know that I'm speaking here to you as a fellow Vermonter. I'm pleading with you as our state legislators to come together and support the implementation of the Pupil Waiting Factors report. Because as a Vermonter, I know that we are defined by our passion for equity and a strong democracy. A democracy that we know can only be nourished and strengthened by an educated populace. Now, this democracy that we cherish is really threatened by the inequalities of our current education funding formula. No doubt, I think we all had an inkling that there are cracks to what we hope to achieve and be because of this. It was only a few years ago that legislators commissioned a study that was completed by esteemed University of Vermont professor Tammy Colby and her research team. Her research team used data, okay, I'm going to say used data to highlight what many already suspected. And this, I think, is true, and everybody understands this. It costs more to educate certain types of students. Now, in my day job, I'm a big numbers person, but I also understand that it's sometimes hard to grasp onto the numbers and what it means by the weights. And so let's talk about real life examples that bring these numbers to life. I'm going to say when I joined the board in 2017, I could quickly see that we had a vibrant school district in Winooski, a district where administrators, teachers, and staff embrace an education that would prepare our students for the knowledge economy of today and tomorrow. Generational poverty, though, exists in our city and creates barriers that prevents our students from reaching their full potential. So what does this mean? Generational poverty means that our school district not only needs to consider how to educate our students, but also how to feed them and how to provide them with health care. Because we believe that all of our students deserve to lead a healthy, productive, and successful lives, and that this will help them to better engage with their local and global community. Because many of our families' circumstances, they cannot afford the luxury of taking time off from work to go to the doctors. And that's why we put the healthcare part in our schools. And truthfully, they don't even have time to drop off their children at school, which seems trivial until you realize that our school district cannot afford year-round busing. And this was a choice we made as a school board because we thought it was a better investment to renovate and expand our school building. A building that was built to house only 600 students when we had 800. We were using closets to hold special education sessions. A building that with every passing year, we hoped our 1955 boiler would last another season because replacing it would be cost prohibitive as repairs meant eBaying parts with hopes that other schools had decommissioned their old boiler. So you may ask, why not add everything that we needed into our budget? And the answer is really simple. Our taxes would skyrocket and our school budget would not have a chance of passing a city vote. I also, when I joined I made a promise when I joined the school board that I would not design a school budget that would lead to gentrification. I wanted to make sure that the school we were building and the district we were becoming would continue to be the home for the current residents. Little did I know that the tough choices we were making as a board were directly caused by these inequities in a school funding formula that was created in the 1990s. And I promise you, as you all know, the world has changed a lot since then. I mean, my smartphone right now is much more powerful than any computer I had in college. And I highlight this notion of change because Vermont is also changing. We are in our district enriched by the new Americans who have settled into our state, and I am fortunate enough to live in that city that is home to many of them. And I think if we are to truly integrate and benefit from the diversity of that these families bring, then as a school district, we need to invest extra resources into our educational system. This allows us to build a stronger community. The obvious investment is in our English as a second language program. Some see this as a burden, but I see this as an investment. Why? Because once they learn, our students learn to communicate in our common language of English, we see the brilliance of our new American students who oftentimes know more than one language and have many new ideas to share with our students. And more importantly, they share with us their perseverance and grit. I've been fortunate enough in my time in the school district to mentor at least 2 new Americans, and I already can see the investment paying off. One of them even has dreams of becoming the governor of Vermont. Think about that. A student that we invest in wants to stay in here to be a leader in our state. And today, I'm proud to tell you that he actually did his college interview with Yale today in my home. And if you ask why in my home, because he was worried about the internet connection. These are the inequities that we sometimes face and the lack of resources that we have. The other investment, if you see in our district, is in our cultural liaisons. These liaisons help us build a community where all of our family can support and take part in their children's education. a fact that is often taken for granted by many of us. Our cultural liaisons do more than translate and ensure constant communication between parents and our schools. They also help build trust between the new American population and the government. We have to remember here, many of them were exiled from their countries because they were vocal about their government. Regardless of us actually welcoming them to our country, it doesn't take a leap of faith as to understand why they don't trust government, right? And this was made more evident to me when two of our students made this wonderful music video almost a year ago that's called Let's Go to School in Swahili, their native language. Their song was about how Vermont gave them an opportunity for a better life. But when Representative Welch wanted to meet these students, which for many of us see as an honor, it took our cultural liaisons several hours to convince their parents to let them meet him. They feared that having a governmental official know them would mean future trouble. I actually do not blame them for feeling this way because of their past experiences with government. I am fortunate enough that their trust in our school and allows us to slowly build stronger bonds. Stronger bonds are formed between them and the community at large. This is not meant to be a complaint, but an illustration of reality. I cannot emphasize enough, we want these families here because they enrich our community. Thus, our cultural liaisons who have teaching degrees from their home countries are worthwhile investments for our schools and city. And truthfully, I hope there are ways for us to increase their salaries because they are woefully underpaid. Having a formula that is inequitable means we depend on people's generosity and kindness and hope it's enough to cover what should be provided by our state. And I'm going to say that a funding formula that is inequitable causes school districts to be reactive to problems instead of being proactive and strategic. I am proud of our school district and what we have done with the constraints the funding formula has provided us. Think about this. The current weight says that we have about 1,000 equalized pupils, but with the new weights, we would have 1,600 equalized pupils. Imagine what we could do if we did not have such limitations. I talked about that student that's going to interview with Yale and wanting to be governor. That I often joke about, like he's going to be a Disney movie, a start of a Disney movie. But when you think about Disney movies, we think we are highlighting the exceptional and not the norm. And that's what the funding formula is preventing us sometimes from doing, is being the norm and having hope in all of our children. And when you think about it, there's a reason why 62% of our students qualify for free or reduced lunch in our district. Their families cannot afford to live anywhere else. Yet instead of shunning them, our school district embraces the challenges. Please allow the districts that are willing to accept these challenges be given a fair chance to educate their students. I know this is going to be hard work to implement, especially if we continue to deal with the pandemic and its fallout. But the pandemic was the ultimate stress test of our system, and it highlighted even more of the inequities of our educational system. But I also know as Vermonters, we never run away from things that seem difficult. Instead, we steer into it and roll up our sleeves and fix what needs to be fixed. This is your chance to fix inequities that have been made worse by the pandemic. And I want to, right at this moment, really say thank you to the students in Winooski who are teaching school board members like me and how to create an anti-racist school district. And one of the many lessons that they have taught us is that it's imperative for us as adults that we stand up when we see inequities, especially inequities that affect them. As you see today, the examples today I provided, hope gives a little bit more face to the numbers that you hear about in the weighting study. Because these are, I'm advocating for the people who are often voiceless and cannot be here to advocate for themselves. And I really hope I did them right by being their advocate. Many of our students start their morning pledging their allegiance to the United States, a nation they believe to be indivisible with liberty and justice for all. Let's work together and make this a reality for all of our children. Let's stand up and fight for equity and equality by passing legislation this session to implement this new empirically derived weights. Do this now, because building an equitable education system allows us to continue having a government that is of the people, by the people, for the people. Doing this now means that we truly care for those who do not have a voice. And I'm going to say it's rare when there's a legislation that can unite so many of us. But this isn't legislation, and this needs to act. But this legislation and this act unites the Northeast Kingdom with Bennington, with Burlington and Winooski, with Rutland, with Montpelier, and with the Windham County. To not take up this bill will be a moral failure on us all. It will signal to our children that we do not care. And if that's the case, then the values that I thought embody what it means to be a Vermonter were false. So let's be leaders and make a better and more equitable Vermont, where our children's futures is not dictated by where they live. Let's do this now. Thank you for giving this moment to speak, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yin. That's powerful testimony. You represent and are involved with an incredibly dynamic, important district. So thank you for your work. I should also mention that Senate Education is looking at a multicultural liaison bill that Senator Rahm put in that hopefully will kind of continue the good work that you have all done throughout the state. So again, thank you for everything that you're doing. Committees, questions for Mr. Yin. Senator Pearson, it's your district. Any questions, comments, anything?
Well, I thank you, Commissioner. And, I haven't heard people disagree with you. I think how and on what kind of timeline are big questions that go far beyond just my choice and Senator Chittenden's choice. But you compelling testimony, and thank you.
Senator Chittenden.
So thank you and for that testimony, Alex. It's good to see you. I will say I completely agree that we need to look at the weighting. I would just echo a earlier comment from Senator Pearson, which is how do you do this in a thoughtful and in phased manner? Because I heard you say in your testimony that if you were to put into your school budget everything that your school needs, there's no way your school budget would pass. I see that same problem if we do this haphazardly, where if it skyrockets the tax bills too quickly of our communities that might be able to afford or based on the new calculations be responsible for contributing it, those bills will fail or those school budgets will fail. So the conversation I want to have at some point, but I don't think now's the time, is how do we actually increase the amount of money available to our schools? And that's where I would assume that's through increasing the tax rate or the tax base. And that's where I want to understand more by exploring conversations, not in this public forum. How do we generate more revenues for our schools so that we're not just shifting these things, ultimately shrinking the pie if we don't do it thoughtfully? But I don't know what else to add. Thank you for your testimony, Alex.
Thank you. Am I allowed to quickly?
Absolutely. If you want to say something, please.
Yeah, no, and I agree. It's a difficult problem to deal with. But I also know that like the current weighting system has been around for 20 years and it's disadvantaged certain communities, right? And I understand. And one of the things that I always tell my school board, and the constituents is that please have faith in the school board members to make intelligent decisions, to think strategically. It is not necessarily that we're going to go spend every dollar that we can, but because let's be true, the other thing about being a true Vermonter is that we're financially responsible. Okay? And we make strategic decisions. And I think that is one of the things that Winooski has done, is that we had the long-term planning and we're thinking how to spend strategically because we have a superintendent and administration to do that with. And I hope that is true of all school districts, because in the long run, I'm the one that stands in front of the school board that has to listen to the parents yelling at me as to why we don't have a school bus, and they have to watch their kid, 6 years old, walking on the sidewalks in the cold. And sometimes they come to school with cold feet, which means we have to then think of ways to get warm socks so that they can learn better. Tell me how that is fair for my students.
Other questions, comments for Mr. Yin? Senator Hardy, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Yin, thank you so much for your testimony. I just wanted to thank you. We visited your school last year, right before the pandemic. And just talking to you was really inspiring, and hearing about the situation in Winooski and all the efforts you were making there. And so it's good to see you again. And I live in a district that would not necessarily benefit from implementing the weighting study. And I have a lot of school districts that are concerned about how or if we're going to do it. And I still think it's the right thing to do, because I believe so firmly in educational equity and opportunity for all kids. And if anybody goes and visits the Winooski school or some of these other schools in other areas of the state and sees the differences between their schools and your schools, it's stark. And so I just appreciate that you're highlighting it and continuing to be persistent. And I think we need to do this well and smart, and not, rush into something that's not a good plan. But I also think we have to have something on the table that starts to move the ball forward, so that that there's some hope for your district and for the kids that you're serving. So thank you.
And thank you. And I know that my students would appreciate that their impact on us is working, and that's what it truly means to be a community, right? And a democracy. And that's what's beautiful. That's what's happening in our school district. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Chair Campion. And thank you, Mr. Yin, for being here. I want to echo the comments that Senator Hardy has made about Winooski. It's an outstanding community, and you've worked very hard to build that school community relationship. We greatly appreciate that. I do want to apologize to the committee for not being able to be here for most of the testimony, but I will read it all, and I may even spend some time looking at the YouTube so I can fully appreciate where we are with the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lyons. Any other questions or comments? I know Senate Finance has a witness at 3. Mr. Yin, thank you very much for joining us. Please stay in touch. And if you would be so kind as to send us, if you have it, the video of going to school in Swahili. It would be great for us all to see. You could send it to one of us and we'll share it, or to one of our committee assistants. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Senate Finance, it was great being with you. I think it's for you all to depart and for us to stay. And it may be that we reconnect on this topic. But until then, thank you for being with us.
A pleasure. And the old committee room looks great, by the way.
What's that?
Just want to compliments on the decorations. And
it's a great committee room. Thank you, Senator Bray.
It's nice. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bray. Senator McDonald.
Yeah.
Have you got it? Are you able to?
I'm tearing myself away. Bye-bye.
Senator Campion.
Please.
That video is embedded in Mr. Yin's testimony.
Oh, it is. Oh, great. Terrific. Great. Okay. Jeannie, I see that Senator Pearson's interested in coming back. Is it that this is our regular Zoom address, or should we be the ones to leave?
No, you're right. Maybe he's confused. Should I let him in, or should I?
No, don't, please.
Right.
We'll find his way. We'll find his way. Thank you. Committee, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and continue on some of our work connected to appropriations. Do you mind coming back at in 15 minutes? Or actually, I will have Jeannie Lowell send you a text or email you.
And she was probably going to email me. I just thought I'd check in around 3.
Oh, I appreciate that. Jeannie, are you there to hear that?
I am, and that was my intention, was to.
Great, terrific.
Yes,
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jeannie. I'll wait for an email. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, we're back. This is Senate Education, continuing our work on Tuesday afternoon, February 23rd. For those of you who are following our work and for colleagues, we are going to today continue our conversation with the Department of Health, recognizing a couple of things. First of all, that Senator Lyons' committee is also doing some of this work and is certainly more responsible for this work. We're glad that Senator Lyons is here to help our work. But what we are trying to figure out in this particular case is we have heard that a grant came in for suicide prevention. And what we are interested in hearing about is how that grant will be rolled out and whether or not the funds that we proposed in our letter are adequate and or even necessary, given that given that grant has come in. And so the chair of approps is interested in having us do that. After we do that, we're going to hear from Senator Rahm and Mr. Desmarais a little bit about Senator Rahm's bill, continuing our tour on suspensions and expulsions. Since S84 has been introduced, we thought it would be worthwhile hearing to see its connection to S16. Why don't we leave it there? So, Ms. Stelber, great to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you. Again, for the record, I'm Elisa Stolberg. I'm the Director of Maternal and Child Health at the Health Department.
Great. And so you understand the situation, I believe, that we're in. We allocated, or we sent a letter of a series of recommends to appropriations, one of which is looking for the Department of Health to partner with the Agency of Education on suicide prevention, warning signs around depression, making certain that parents and families know how to access certain kinds of resources. And Senator Probst wrote to me saying, well, how does this intersect with the grant on suicide prevention? So any guidance you might give to us would be greatly appreciated.
Sure. So my apologies. I don't know how to turn off my phone. I don't know a ton about the suicide prevention grant. It is a joint effort between the Department of Mental Health and also another part of the Health Department, mostly focused around adult, although there is some focus on child suicide prevention. And I'd be happy to get more information for you or connect you with sort of a better spokesperson for that grant. I will share, however, that I feel like the situation that children and youth are facing as a outcome of COVID is really much broader than suicide, and that once you begin to look at suicide prevention, you look pretty narrowly at a group of individuals who are not necessarily very at risk, but I think that the situation in which our young people are faced with right now is actually much broader. And so I would argue that we would want a more multifaceted approach to addressing social emotional health and recovery for students as a consequence of the COVID response or COVID situation. I think Senator Lyons had the opportunity to have hopefully a pretty robust conversation with our partners at the Vermont Child Health Improvement Program on yesterday, I think Monday.
It was yesterday.
I've lost track these days, and really had the opportunity to hear quite a bit from our pediatric colleagues about what they are seeing on the ground with in working with their patients and also working with school health personnel, school nurses, and school administrators throughout the last year. And I think from the perspective of where we sit at the health department, we would really appreciate the opportunity to look at social emotional health in a whole population holistic approach. We certainly feel like our pediatric health colleagues are a good partner in this work, particularly because Vermont has such high rates of well child visits. The pediatricians are seen as a very trusted group of individuals in which to talk with, and also are going to your pediatric providers fairly destigmatized. And so should we, as we've done over the last year, we've really capitalized on those relationships and those partnerships to help support children, youth, and families throughout the pandemic.
Senator Lyons.
Yes, thank you. And yes, it was another rewarding opportunity to hear about linkages between medical, social, educational institutions. And this is an area that our committee is going to be focusing on. Frankly, I think it's probably appropriate for our committee to do that, given that we've been looking at the medical home and the outreach and sort of the care management piece between medical and social public health intervention and support services. So the value I see here in education is ensuring that information, diagnostic, helpful information for folks who are working with children in after school or in summer camp programs, that people are at least alert to and have some understanding of the symptoms and how to maybe help when they're not extreme, and then to refer when they are. So, and a lot of what we're seeing with kids obviously is some behaviors that are new behaviors and of concern. And then, so I think that between our two committees, we can cover all the bases. But I think moving into the area of the whole suicide prevention piece, and the medical home and linkage, probably we should do that in our committee, but it would be neat if at some point our two committees could meet together. You're going to have to meet in the morning. That's all I can say. But but no, seriously, I think it's everybody is so concerned. And what I heard yesterday about what's going on with children and families is so concerning. It is so concerning. And the plans that are being made with after school and educational folks, they're really good plans. I think having the summer programs and providing some of the fast track money for that's absolutely the right thing to do. I think if we try to do too much, we won't do anything. So my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly helpful. So what I think, as appropriation, well, two things. First of all, Stolberg, if you would be so kind as to track down that colleague of yours that knows the ins and outs of the grant, and email our committee assistant, and I suspect Senator Lyons' committee would also, if they don't know this, would be interested in it. How is the grant going to be used? And we would forward that also, if you would please be so kind as to send that to Senator Kitchell. Have that person loop her in as well. I think Senator Lyons is right. Her committee is going to be doing the large lift in this work. And I think her point's a good one, that as we continue to work with our after school and summer program partners, there should be something built in to making certain that those teachers, those coaches, those counselors are cognizant of the warning signs that we're talking about here, and you know what that might look like in training, or if it's just, again, letting people know. But I will I'll look for an email from your colleague or from you. For now, we'll just keep the dollar amount in. It's sitting in approps. I'll loop back to Senator Kitchell saying that she should expect an email from your colleague, just giving some ideas to how those dollars will be used. And they will also probably be pulling you and DOE in to sort of get a better sense of this, to see if and I suspect Senator Lyons as well, to see if we keep it in as is, or if there's a way that it needs to be adjusted. How does that sound to you?
That sounds great. I will follow up right away. I will add that we did a lot of work with the after school and summer providers last spring and summer, and even into the fall around COVID prevention and setup of their communities. And we also talk with those providers all day, every day. And so we have a good foundation in which to work with them. We're organizing something to meet with them about this summer coming up, and upcoming guidance. So I think it would be very easy for us to sort of capitalize or leverage those relationships in order to also be able to provide this other, added element beyond sort of, how to wear your mask and wash your hands, to also talk about social emotional health.
So the best way for us to make certain that counselors and others are aware of this, signs and symptoms of emotional health, can we leave that with you, or is that something that you want us to do something with?
I think so. I mean, we would certainly talk with our partners at DMH, as well as the Vermont After School and other organizations that sort of convene these, and we'd be happy to talk about the best way to get that messaging across. It's certainly on the top of everybody's mind. I know you heard from Holly Morehouse. She's certainly thinking about it. So I think this would be welcome and of interest to the field.
Senator Hooker.
Yes, Senator, thank you. One of the things that I don't want to see lost in this kind of where do we find a home for this is the fact that you had initially talked about parents being educated to the symptoms. And I'm hoping that, wherever that fits in, whether it fits in health and welfare or in education and, with the health department, wherever it is, I would hope that we can keep a focus on parents also being educated along with the school personnel.
Yeah, I would say that we need a multifaceted approach to reaching parents and families. Certainly we do that through the medical home. I think schools are certainly doing that. We've done a little bit of that just through our, public health messaging throughout the COVID response. And I know that DMH has done that as well, but we certainly can think about how to keep that message going and seeing. I think we think of signs and symptoms as being very obvious, but sometimes they're very small or minor, or a shift in behavior that really can be that first sign. And I think seeing it the sooner the better is important.
Yeah, and Senator Hooker, I'm inclined to keep, our letter has been sent to APROPS. They have it. The $500,000 directing to collaborate with AOE and Department of Health to educate parents. So we'll keep that, as is, and we'll see what we hear back regarding how the suicide prevention grant is being used. And I think just if there's any overlap with those kinds of funds. Senator Lyons. Oh, no question. Okay, I saw you unmuted. Senator Perschlick or Senator Chittenden? Anything? Okay. We know you have your hands full. Thank you for all that you're doing. And you guys are on the front lines. So thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. I'll
We'll
be
look for an email.
Yes, thank you.
Jim, my sincere, I hope the farewell was beautiful.
It was absolutely beautiful. It's fine.
All right.
I'm very sad right now, though. So
I know. Yeah. I'm sure. How long is she gone until?
She lives there. She lives in England.
She does live in England.
Wow.
She's an actor, and she's lived there for a couple of years. Yeah.
All right.
Where does she? What part of England?
London. She lives in South London. Yep.
Oh yeah. Nice. London is awesome.
That was great. We lived there for 8 years, and
Yeah.
she's a citizen, and yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So my daughter lived there for several years. She loved it. So did we.
Yeah, no, my partner was there for a couple of years, and it was just so great being able to go over once in a while.
Just too darn expensive.
It's way too expensive.
Yeah.
Way too expensive, yeah. But Jim, I feel like I should put out some kind of apology to her, either through Buckingham Palace or through the state Senate. But I hope truly in no way did I interrupt that departure.
It was absolutely fine. No worries.
All right. So thank you. So with that, school discipline, we have a bill that I think we're getting close to moving. And then Senator Rahm was kind enough to
Throw that all in the air.
no, not at all. Was kind enough to put in a bill related to school discipline. And so I think, did you need to get that, Senator? Okay.
No, do you have like a $1 jar that I should Venmo you for? Sorry.
And so before we take any steps, it's important to try to see if there might be a place for this in S16. I know you've talked to Senator Sears. And so with that, I thought what we could do first, if it works for your schedule, Jim, is just have Senator Rahm tell us about the bill, the genesis of it, what you hope to do, and to see if maybe there is a spot where we could place it, given that we have just one more week after this to handle work before crossover. So with that, Senator Rahm.
Well, thank you, Chairman Campion and committee, and I do appreciate you giving this kind of another look before passing it out. And the chairman asked me to be very prepared. So I have lots of charts and graphs and studies at my fingertips in case people want more information, but I'll just really start with the genesis of this, and Jim was there for the play-by-plays. I introduced legislation, I believe, starting in 2014 to try in the House to try and limit the use of suspension and expulsion as a behavioral tool. Being a new senator, Senator Sears and I started talking about collaborating on this issue very early on. And we thought, let's have one bill where we're co-sponsors of more of a, study, and let the schools and districts decide what to come back with and what makes sense for their communities. We had talked about how my being the lead on a separate bill that would really ask us to call this to question a bit more and fully start limiting the use of suspension and expulsion as a tool, and what we would call excluding kids from school as a way to manage their behavior. Once this study started moving, I really didn't want to put out a whole separate bill that seemed to kind of contradict what we were asking the districts to do from outside of the State House. It can be very complicated if you say, we're putting this out as a conversation piece. The few things that I just couldn't let go of and may end up deepening the study component in some way are the experience of suspensions and expulsions, but particularly expulsions of children under the age of 8. And actually, as I was doing my research, what became clearer and clearer is a lot of other states, and maybe the committee's looking at this as well, are actually starting to look at the pre-K experience of expulsion, because pre-Ks, without being regulated the same way as K through 12 education, tend to expel kids at a rate about 3 times higher or more. And within pre-Ks, so within childcare centers and early education settings, the racial disparities and other types of disparities are even worse. So I have some studies that I could share with you to that end, but the pre-K to prison pipeline is a real thing that a lot of states are looking at. But at the same time, that would require a kind of more nuanced approach to this legislation to deal with pre-Ks. So my bill, I believe, which does 2 things, and one is call for us to stop expelling children under 8, would then you'd probably be looking at the data from kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade about how many students are separated from their school because of an expulsion. The challenge is the data that I have from the Agency of Education, I'm happy to share this chart with you, is by grade. So it starts with kindergarten, and you will be able to see, and I can share my screen if it's helpful for folks, that about 10% of our separations from school happen in kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade. And
let's ask a quick question. Sorry to interrupt. I'm just wondering, so by separation from school, that is suspension and or expulsion?
It's both. And all they tell you in these charts is the average number of days of the separation. Okay. And that even follows into high school. So I'm sure by the time you get to high school, they much more clearly break out who got suspended for a day or a week, who got expelled forever, who got sent to a different school. But what AOE is currently tracking is separation from school and the average number of days. And so it's fewer days. The average number of days is about 1 that kids from kindergarten to 2nd grade are separated from school, but it's not possible to tell which is suspension and expulsion. And if you wanted to take more testimony on this particular issue, either Agency of Education or in addition, Jay Diaz from the ACLU are the ones who've been tracking this most closely. Jay's on vacation, but even from his vacation, he helped point me to this chart so I could get you, that specific information. And one thing that he added is that based on their work, and we had this included in our 2014 bill to stop expelling children at a very young age, meaning separating them from the school environment, excluding them from the school environment. He would advocate that it's 4th grade and below. That seems to him to be a pretty good cutoff for a very young child who needs interventions rather than exclusion from school.
Do you have a sense, Senator Rahm, why students are being suspended or expelled from kindergarten? Please.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
They have elementary school, middle school, and high school sort of broken out of really in all cases, about at less than 10%, and definitely in elementary school, less than 10% are violent in nature. It's a lot of behavioral issues, disruption, et cetera. And then, the whole experience with the 4 to 5-year-olds, the kind of pre-K issues, many have to do with parents not being able to get their child to school on time, the child acting out, exhibiting inappropriate behaviors. But, a lot of it, and that relates to the second piece of this, which is also encouraging the committee to study how truancy is handled around the state. We have some, counties that have said, or districts or counties, because it's a county level issue if it gets kicked up to the state's attorney as a kind of more criminalized issue. But we have some counties and districts that are saying, we're not touching truancy at all in the pandemic. We have others that are very much, calling on families to do better and still sending cases to the state's attorney. So if a school feels like they can't intervene in the appropriate way with a family, or they have sent a certain number of communications out, the case goes to the state's attorney's office. Now, I don't always want to use Chittenden County as an example, but they had a whole countywide task force to say, is there any way we could stop criminalizing families for truancy? And so they looked at a lot of, check boxes and other things you need to do to offer wraparound services to the family before a case goes to the state's attorney. And it's resulted in a much lower number of truancies that get advanced to the state's attorney's office. I have looked at other states. I have some of those charts and graphs available, and where they have implemented statewide interventions before sending a case to the judicial system for truancy, they've seen cases of truancy that result in the criminalization of either the youth or the family. In Vermont, we don't criminalize the youth. We're one of a handful of states that doesn't criminalize the youth, but we still do potentially criminalize the family for truancy, the parents or the guardian. And so states where they've stopped criminalizing the family as well and looked at ways to intervene in cases of truancy, they've significantly dropped the numbers of truancies, the days missed of school, really intervened in the appropriate ways into what that family might be in crisis or might be lacking some key resource that helps them get their child to school on time. So those are the two pieces. Sorry to jump around a little bit.
No, it's helpful. And I appreciate you being here and having a discussion with us, since we are, timing, we're not there, but, we would like to start to advance some things. And I know this is something that the pro tem is interested in, and others, school discipline in general, particularly as it relates to, if you will, minority students, and students, disabled students. But one of the things I'm wondering, trying to get your sort of thoughts on is, so if I'm speaking honestly, I worry a little bit, but my committee may completely disagree, that we as a committee would be making sort of that kind of policy decision. And I wonder if it makes more sense for it to come from the Agency of Education. As I mentioned to you, Senator Rahm, on the phone, I'm just wondering, the legislature sometimes in the state sometimes does say never, ever, ever, ever. But I do worry that there are going to be cases where a suspension or expulsion is warranted. What I want to make certain happens is the educational experience continues, but might there be something where a teacher comes to a principal or the school personnel and says, this really does warrant a suspension, even though I know the gravity of what that would mean for the child. Again, just thinking about it, to be sent home as a kindergartner at any age, but particularly young age, suspended or expelled, is something we would want to avoid at all costs. So that's just some of my thinking. And the committee might say, no, perfectly comfortable with moving in this direction as you've outlined. Or do we kind of somehow incorporate it into this overall study that we're looking at, and saying for the agency to come back and make some real decisions for us along this? I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or.
I do, because I can understand the gravity of this, particularly approaching crossover without a lot of additional testimony. I would say, and I'm happy to, work with Jim further on some drafting, but I would say there's 3 things that the committee could possibly do to strengthen the existing study. Yeah. After doing all this research and really appreciating you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to come back in and keep chewing on this with you all. One, many states are starting to track the experience of expelling children from preschool, even if they have no control over that. They are starting to sort of pay attention and keep track of, which childcare centers are expelling a lot of kids. Is that an experience? And they are seeing huge racial disparities and income disparities in who's getting expelled from pre-K, as you might imagine. When it comes to this issue of what's the right age to just say, we really shouldn't be expelling children. I would love to see the Agency of Education come back and say, here's the age. It's second, third, fourth grade. It's some age where we say, that we really can't find a good reason that we should exclude this child from a school environment, have their whole family and them go through the trauma of what do you do now? Where do they go to school? How many days do they miss school while they're trying to be placed somewhere else? What does it mean to be in that new school? And then this truancy piece, just sort of adding that for your consideration, because it's sort of another way that we punish families for crises and other things affecting the young person's absence, not behavior in terms of what they do at school, but just their lack of presence from school is sort of often another sign of some kind of distress that we're not intervening with properly or carefully.
Yeah. Committee, questions for Senator Rahm at this point? Senator Perchlik, please.
Yeah, thanks for being here, and thanks, Chair. The question, again, I don't know, it was a question or a comment, but interesting, do you think, Senator Rahm, is the bill isn't a study that, the one you co-sponsored, the other one, it's a task force to say we will end expulsions for everybody so it seems like we're already there, but I just reread it and I thought we could strengthen there, because it says make recommendations to end expulsion. So maybe we just say implement prohibition on expulsions or something. But it does say except for the most severe circumstances or something like that. But I wondered if you felt that was, if you thought we need to change that word, because it seems like taking your new 84 bill and just adding it to 13 is the best way to go, since you're sponsors of both. And if you thought that language that we had in there, so if it was just a study, it seems like we don't need another study. But since it's kind of like, okay, how do we implement this? It seems like that would be the way to go.
Right. This is just a data point of one, but the reason I introduced this bill originally years ago was, really traumatic experiences where a child was, had an accident or did something on the playground and, were suspended or expelled. And a lot of parents of color were coming to me and saying, I don't know what to do. I don't even know if I can live in this state anymore. So, I have seen certainly so much of the urgency and the trauma of removing a child from school. I think the only thing that might balance that out is the trauma of being on the receiving end of some kind of behavior and being triggered by having that person in your immediate presence. And some schools may be so small that there's no way to separate them on a larger campus or put them in a classroom that's much further away. So I really do still try to balance, that experience of, what it means to be a victim. I was saying to the chairman, I was arguing with my fiance about this, who grew up in Charlotte. He was 7 when his friend on the school bus made him spit a spitball at the bus driver, and they both got suspended. And he said it like straightened him out and made him a better person, And then I said, well, what happened to the other kid? He said, oh, he's in jail now or something. So it was like, okay, well, if you have a family structure that says what did you just do, and really intervenes and uses that as a tool, but you can get that intervention without that suspension or expulsion, where another family might say, great, forget it. You're never going back, or whatever the case may be. So hopefully, when these ideas were proposed, a lot of them were in that restorative justice framework of, if you're not going to, expel or suspend a student, what are you going to do to repair harm to the victim of whatever they perpetrated, and make sure they don't have lingering trauma that goes unaddressed, and, help that person be empowered to repair the harm, so that they ultimately take more responsibility for their actions in the future. I know we're talking about restorative justice too, so it's jumping all over.
So Senator Perchlik, you're proposing that, given the way our Q.1 is written, that we, and S84, that we, in a way, merge both of them.
It seems like the easiest way to do it.
Yeah. Senator Lyons, you want to weigh in?
That was actually a suggestion I was going to make. And then the other question is, Senator Rahm, if you have any of the data that you would like to share with the committee to support our decision, that would be really helpful.
Would it be preferable in an email to the committee, kind of as a package of
That,
information?
that would be
Great.
terrific.
Okay, great.
That would be great. Senator Hooker, Senator Chittenden, any concerns with that movement to merge these two?
I think I would support that, in that, you know, we have important pieces of each of them, and so put them together rather than trying to do one or the other. And certainly it would make a lot of sense.
Okay, Senator Chittenden. Okay. It's good to have people from Chittenden County on here that you can influence, even though.
Well, you know, I mean,
we're a team. It's a team effort.
Right. That's right.
I do have a question regarding alternative situations for students who have, you know, perhaps serious issues. You mentioned, Senator Rahm, that, you know, a small percentage are because of violence, that kids are expelled. We do have alternative ed, you know, here in Rutland, and I know that there have been some very young children who have been, you know, put in alternative classes. How would something like this intersect with the bill, or the attempt to sort of ban expulsion?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm sure your committee is constantly trying to look at, what does separate but equal look like? You know, whether it's special education or English language learning or alternative programs, you know, is the intent ultimately to help return them to the school environment, or is it a place for them to get relegated for the remainder of their time in school? And if that happens to them at a very young age, you know, then what is the next step? Do they ultimately get returned to the feeder, you know, is that a feeder school back to the middle school or high school, or, you know, do they get sort of left in an alternative program for the remainder of their days? We should have more data on these things. And, you know, we should know, I mean, what we get often as senators is stories that break our hearts, that seem to not add up to, you know, the full picture. And then we know that we're probably not going to necessarily hear the stories when something pretty horrific did happen necessarily. So, you know, better data to know, is it a temporary move to an alternative program? Do they get put back in with the regular school population? So much of the language of these reports about exclusion and separation remind me a lot of special education and ELL, where you could just end up feeling like you're not a part of a larger community for a long time. And that can have a really detrimental effect on your outcomes and your ability to function in society. And you sort of end up on that continuum to feeling like an outlier from society, which is what we end up calling the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah. No, I really feel like we're tackling something important here, and we're going to look to your support on the floor when we get any questions. Especially, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, very eloquent committee members. I don't know who's reporting. I'm sure they'll do better than I.
Senator Chittenden.
Yeah, right. He likes to disappear off the screen.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. Thanks for your advocacy. We do have about 11 other bills of yours in this committee that we are working to advance. You know, one other in particular, though, we heard wonderful testimony this morning or this afternoon, like 20 minutes ago, from a Mr. Yin from Winooski, who also spoke of the incredible work that multicultural liaisons do. So that's also hopefully something we might be able to package up into, we're hoping, into our miscellaneous bill. So, Senator Rahm, thank you for taking the time from government operations. Please remember our kindness when you redistrict all of us.
Just by virtue of this being my second or third visit, I'm biased, but I can tell you're doing really amazing work, and it couldn't come at a more critical time for our kids who are feeling really isolated and lost, and like they need a sense of belonging again. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you. And if the press is listening, hopefully they captured that.
You have a great chair committee. I have said that before.
Goodbye. Thank you, Senator Rahm. Thank you. Mr. Desmarais, I think seems like a very straightforward, even though I'm usually the one that needs walkthroughs more than anyone. I don't know, is there anything overarching that you'd like to say about the bill? It looks like it's the committee's preference to merge the two. And again, it does look pretty straightforward. It does look like I'll need a fiscal note, and I'll request that from joint fiscal before we vote it out. But I am hoping to move this, if at all possible, in the next day or so.
So you want to merge them. Do you want to turn the prohibition on expulsion for students under age 8 into part of the report, the study, for recommendation on that, or do you just want to put that in as a requirement?
The way I'm reading the committee, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misreading the committee, is that we should put that in going forward as a requirement. Is that, I mean, that looks to me, or did I misread and folks really feel, senators feel as though they would like this as part of a study? Senator Perchlik, you made the initial comment, please.
Well, the way it is, maybe we need to change the wording on S16 or whatever the number is a little bit, 18, to say that it's clear that we're ending expulsions except for the most extreme situations. So that includes people under the age of 8. The age of 8. So I don't know if we need to include that specific language in the other bill, but we might want to be clear that the recommendations are basically, here's the new policy. We shall not have expulsions. How does that work in a school? How is each district going to deal with it? Because if you just say you can't have expulsions, I can see just a bunch of questions coming back from every school district saying, okay, well, what about if they bring a gun to school? Or what's our responsibility for those children that we do expel under the extreme situation? So my understanding of this task force, which I don't think we should call it a study,
right?
The task force is saying, we will not have expulsions. Here's how you deal with, except in these extreme situations. Here's what those extreme situations are, and here's how you implement it. You know, we talk about in the bill about let me get to that language. It's on page 4, I think. Yeah, right. We're asking us to do the data collection and analyzing, but just kind of how they're going to make this happen in every school. Right, to inform strategic planning, guide statewide and local decision
making. Yes.
Yeah, like all that stuff.
Right.
I mean, that's the way I see it. I don't know if that helps. Or
that gives us, you know, that's going to help answer, I think, a lot of concerns out there. Again, that this task force is looking at this and going to be strategizing and working and informing school districts how to work with students of that. Yeah, please.
Well, okay, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
So Jim, do you think that the language where it says make recommendations to end suspensions is ending suspensions, or is it just making recommendations to end them? You know, so like, at what point, if this was how it passed, would suspensions and expulsions end? At some point in the future, and we would need further legislative action, or would this be sufficient?
So you're looking at specific language now in the bill, right? In S16.
Yes.
Where are you looking exactly?
Line 7 on page 4.
Yeah, mine doesn't have page numbers. Let me find where I am.
It's section 2, the creation of the task force. Third line of that task force and school reform report.
Oh, right in the creation section. Yeah. Yeah, they're recommending to you making recommendations as to ending suspensions and expulsions, but you would have to take action based on those recommendations and change statute. The statute currently permits these practices, so you have to make a separate change there to implement that.
Okay.
So if you wanted to, you could take Senator Rahm's language and prohibit expulsions for children under 8, and then add to the study a line that requires them to look at how school districts could implement that in terms of how they would help school districts decide how they would deal with the fact that they can't expel these kids. So you could add that to your task force if you want.
I'd be for that. And also, and maybe the wording is already enough there to say that, yeah, we are going to end that expulsions for those under that age. How do we implement that? But then also tell us where to draw the line for the extreme expulsions. And I wondered if we need, at least on my point of view, I would like to have it say that kind of it is the policy that for even over 8, we don't want to have expulsions, but maybe we need to draw the line somewhere. I agree what I think the chair was saying to Senator Rahm, that there are these situations, like we heard from Secretary French, if somebody brings a gun to school, I think the school should have the ability to say, okay, you're not coming back till tomorrow. We need to figure out what's going on. So I don't want to just say there is none, but somebody needs to figure out where that line is drawn. So.
Well, that's what they're doing, I think, already, right?
Right.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I guess it's back. I guess I was reading it wrong to your original question, Senator Campion, is that sounds like we would have to add that language from S84 about the not allowing expulsions under age 8.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's a way to say something like, so the extreme example would be if the individual is going to cause harm to himself or others, him or herself or others, that provides for some protection and allows for decision making. That's usually the phrase that's used in a variety of areas. So
Yeah, the potential to harm
yeah,
or others. So they may not have actually done it, but they have a weapon or something like that. Senator Perchlik?
Well, I wondered if Senator Lyons was making that comment in reference to the 8-year-olds and under, which I'm okay with maybe, but.
Yes, that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
You were looking for the extreme cases. It would seem to me that would be about as extreme as you can get. So, I mean, if it's harm to oneself, then you would want to ensure that the school would have in place some referral system or support system for the kid. And if it's to others, then you want to make sure that the child is home and the family, if there is a family, or the guardian or caregiver knows. So there's a lot of work that schools have to do, and so that I like Jim's suggestion as well.
Senator Perchlik?
And Jim, in this context, in this part of the statute, when it says a student, how is that defined? Is that, to Senator Rahm's point about, does that include preschool kids, or does it only,
Preschool is tricky, right? Because preschool that happens in a school is under AOE's jurisdiction. Preschool that happens in a private care center or family home provider is under Human Services jurisdiction. And they have joint rules that kind of cover these areas, but it's not quite clear to me what the expulsion and suspension rules are for pre-K kids in child care centers and family care homes. I'm not sure what that is.
But is Title 16 only dealing with kind of schools under the control of AOE?
Title 16 in this area is quite complex because it's got joint authority given to AOE and AHS. to oversee these programs. But the programs are under, while they have joint rulemaking authority for both, they are siloed in terms of oversight. AOE for in-school, AHS for private centers. So I just don't know the answer to your question about what happens in those childcare centers and home care centers or family homes on this question about how much rules apply to them.
It's a great question. I mean, we're saying, I mean, I'm inclined to think we keep this pretty narrow and it be clear that we're not talking about, private home centers, something somebody has it, a parent might have it at their home. And I think we tighten that up, Jim, to either say, pre-K through, again, 12.
It's under age of 8, but I can say under age of 8 enrolled in a school. Right? That'll carve out the private side.
Right. Because school is defined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Public school. Yeah.
That sounds good.
Okay.
So am I hearing that you want also to add a caveat to her prohibition to say, except in the case of extreme circumstances?
Such as?
I use the right words, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or use Senator Lyons' language.
Yeah, that's what I think. Senator Lyons is the way to go.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, well, maybe, I don't know if that other language needs to be changed about the recommendations.
Right. So I think that's, something we have to decide. Are these recommendations that they are going to come back to us with, or are we asking them to, implement a policy? Well, go ahead, Jim.
Because because suspension and exclusionary policies are in statute, so they can't do anything more than make a recommendation to you, because you're gonna have to go change the statutes to implement that.
What do people think? I mean, I'm trying to think of language. So what would the language be, Jim, if we wanted this to happen immediately? I mean, we're basically saying, no matter what, they're going to have to come back and talk to us, right? I mean, unless we were making a policy that was completely overarching and or bad adjective, but unless we were saying, we're getting rid of suspensions and expulsions right now, any work that's being done in this working group is going to have to come back to us.
Right. Well, this is what calls for. They're going to come back to you with a recommendation.
I mean, I'm just trying to think. I'm not sure if Senator Persick, were you thinking about altering line 7 where it says recommend to end, or to say, or to end suspensions? Either way, it kind of comes back to us. You know what I'm saying? I'm not sure if that's helpful or.
Yeah, I guess I think that we probably keep it the way it is, and that there are complications, and might even come up with the under 8-year-olds, but that it's better for the task force to look at it holistically and then come back to us and say, like, okay, here's how you need to change this.
Yeah.
It says pretty clear we're going to end it, so they can't come back and say, well, don't end it.
Right. We're directing them that's the way we want to move.
But the task force doesn't have the power to end.
I understand. Right. Yeah.
So all they can do is come back with recommendations.
Right.
Is there a date certain by which that it will end, regardless of when the task force comes back? So in other words, the task force could come back with very compelling reason not to end it. And then, but in the meantime, we could say that it will end. So we could say it's going to end. Let's just pick a date out of our heads. It's going to end January 1st, 2022, or no, March 1st, 2022. And the task force report will come back January 2022. There's 2 months there for any change to that effective date. Is that something we should do, or do we want?
How does senators feel about that? I mean, that gives it, either way is fine with me.
I'm happy just ending it, but
Right.
but you do want the task force to feel like they're actually doing something.
Yeah. Yeah, let's leave it without the date for right now, if that's all right, Senator Lyons.
Oh, I'm fine.
Okay, and
Yeah.
then Jim, do you have enough direction, just looking that it's after 4, and I know we have a chairs meeting, and Senator Lyons, you feel free to go when you need to, and I think Senator Hooker, I don't know if you go to those, but feel free to.
Yeah, I'm fine. I can, no problem. Yeah.
Okay. Senator Persick, do you or Senator Hooker, final
Just a quick
questions for
question
Jim?
to clarify, as far as under 8,
Yeah.
that would be immediate, and anything else would be subject to what the recommendation of the commission is.
I'm sorry, would you repeat the first part of that?
Banning expulsions for kids under 8 would be immediate.
Yeah.
And then the rest would follow as the data is collected.
Exactly, save for circumstances as outlined by Senator Lyons.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. So Jim, if you'd be so kind as to email the entire committee a new draft when you're done.
Sure.
So it would give people an opportunity to look at things this evening. We could comment some more. And I will ask Joint Fiscal to do a fiscal note. Senator Chin, and I want to remind you, about 5 weeks ago, we were working on this, and it looked like we were nearing completion. You said, well, if sausage making is this easy, it's fine with me. Now we're really into making sausage.
It'll be great sausage.
Yeah, it's going to be great sausage. I like that. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Jim, thanks again.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.